It doesn't start with a tumor under the skin. It starts with a cough. At first, a dry, throat-scratching, dog-like bark that makes you wince and clutch your chest. Then it becomes deeper, wetter, erupting from the very depths of your lungs with each agonizing, body-racking spasm. Soon, every one of your exhales becomes a cloud of pink foam, a deadly aerosol saturated with your own blood. Your lungs are no longer yours. They have turned into two spongy sacs, rapidly filling with blood, mucus, and pus. You try to inhale fresh air, but you only breathe in your own decaying flesh, tasting its sweetish, putrid flavor on your tongue. You are drowning from the inside, fully, crystal clearly conscious, in the deafening silence of your own room. This is pneumonic plague, a 100% inescapable mortality. For you, there is no hope, no cure, no salvation. He immediately and publicly declared, "The disease is transmitted through the air from person to person," but no one believed him. Foreign doctors, Russian, Japanese, French, working in Harbin, openly laughed at him. They were certain that the plague, as their experience had taught them, was transmitted only through fleas. They continued to work without any respiratory protection, and one by one began to die. The famous French doctor, Professor Mesny, who had come to fight the epidemic, scornfully refused the gauze mask offered to him by Wu Liante, stating that he was too young and inexperienced. 2 days later, Professor Mesny was dead. Wu Liante understood that he had to act decisively, harshly, and without regard for authorities. He obtained extraordinary powers from Beijing, effectively becoming the medical dictator of Harbin. His measures were unprecedented and seemed barbaric to many. He divided the city into sectors, imposed a strict quarantine, forbidding any movement between them. He converted thousands of empty railway carriages into isolation units for the sick, their contacts, and the suspected. He organized mobile teams to find and isolate the sick. But the main problem was the corpses. Thousands of frozen bodies lying in the streets and in hastily dug shallow pits. The bacterium could survive in frozen tissues for weeks, and with the arrival of the spring thaw, the epidemic would have erupted with new, unimaginable force, contaminating the soil and water. They had to be destroyed. But cremation was contrary to all Chinese traditions and beliefs. Wu Liante took a desperate and bold step. He sent a memorandum to the emperor in which, risking his own head, he pleaded for permission to carry out mass cremation as the only measure to save the nation. On the eve of the Chinese New Year, the most sacred holiday, permission was granted. Throughout Harbin, in specially dug trenches, giant funeral pyres blazed, in which more than 2,000 bodies were burned. It was a psychological and epidemiological turning point. But Dr. Wu's most important and simplest invention was the protective mask. He realized it was necessary to protect the respiratory tracts of doctors, nurses, soldiers, and gravediggers. He developed a simple but strikingly effective design of several layers of gauze and cotton, which fit snugly against the face and trapped the deadly droplets. It was the direct ancestor of the modern surgical mask and the N95 respirator. Thanks to these masks, which he made everyone wear, the mortality rate among medical personnel dropped to almost zero. In 4 months of titanic, inhuman effort, Dr. Wu Liante and his international team did the impossible. They stopped the Manchurian plague. They, without exaggeration, saved the world from a pandemic that could have been worse than the Black Death. By April 1911, the last case was registered. The total number of victims was about 60,000 people. A terrible figure, but it could have been thousands of times larger. Wu Liante became a national hero and the father of modern medicine in China. It seemed that with the advent of antibiotics like streptomycin in the mid-20th century, the plague was finally and irrevocably defeated. It had become a disease of the past, a historical curiosity, a bogeyman story for medical students, and a plot for horror films. But this was a dangerous and arrogant illusion. The predator had not died. It had simply fallen into a deep slumber. Sometimes it awakens to remind us of its presence. Almost every year, plague outbreaks occur in Madagascar. The perfect conditions for its existence are found there. Poverty, unsanitary conditions, political instability, and a unique local ecology with special species of black rats and insecticide-resistant fleas. Most cases are bubonic plague, which is still highly treatable with antibiotics if therapy is started in time. But sometimes, in conditions of overcrowding and late diagnosis, it develops into the pneumonic form. And then a desperate race against time begins, an attempt to stop a forest fire with a single cup of water. But there is an even more terrifying threat, one created not by nature, but by man himself. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the USA, in their top-secret biological laboratories, conducted intensive work on creating weaponized strains of plague. As part of the biopreparat program, Soviet scientists attempted to develop bacteria resistant to all known antibiotics and even to vaccines. It is unknown how successful they were, and what happened to all these developments after the collapse of the USSR and the chaos of the 90s. The thought that a vial with such a strain could fall into the wrong hands is blood-curdling. But nature can do this without human help, and it does so constantly. Bacteria constantly mutate, exchange genes, developing resistance to drugs. And already, strains of Yersinia pestis with multiple drug resistance are periodically being recorded around the world. What will happen if one day, as a result of natural evolution, a strain emerges against which all our antibiotics are powerless? What if it appears not in an isolated African village, but in a metropolis of millions with an international airport? But perhaps your end will be different. We have forgotten the primal, animal terror our ancestors felt in the face of the Black Death. We have put too much faith in the indestructible power of our science, in our sterile hospitals and magic antibiotics. But the ancient enemy is still here. It patiently lurks in the burrows of marmots on the steppes of Asia, in the colonies of prairie dogs on the prairies of America, in the forests of Africa. It waits. It waits for our control to weaken, for another war, famine, social chaos, or climate change. It is biding its time to hunt again. The plague is not just history, it is an eternal warning. No cough, no tumors, no warning signs. Just a sudden, all-consuming heat, as if you were thrown into a blast furnace and your skin doused with boiling oil. The room swims before your eyes, the walls bend and breathe, sounds drown in a deafening roar in your ears. You fall unconscious before you can realize you are dying, your consciousness extinguished like a snuffed-out candle. The bacteria are already in your blood, multiplying at an exponential rate, staging an orgy of destruction in every corner of your body. Your blood, the very river of life, clots right inside your vessels, forming thousands of microscopic clots that, like grains of sand, clog the finest capillaries. Circulation stops, first in the extremities, bringing with it an icy chill, then everywhere. The tissues, deprived of oxygen, begin to rot while you are still breathing, while your heart is still desperately, convulsively beating, pumping not blood through your veins, but a black poison. The skin on your fingers and toes, on the tip of your nose and ears, turns cold, then blue, then charcoal black, like charred wood. It dries up, shrivels, and dies, turning into a hard, necrotic crust that crumbles at the slightest touch. You are turning into a living corpse, into your own mummy, watching as your body dies piece by piece. This is septicemic plague, the Black Death in its purest, fastest, and most ruthless form. And only then, if you are lucky enough to live long enough in this agony, does that classic symptom appear. The one that gave the disease its frightening name and became its bloody calling card for centuries. A lymph node in the groin, armpit, or on the neck begins to swell at an alarming rate. First, it is the size of a pea, then a walnut, then an orange, stretching the skin to unimaginable limits. The skin over it tightens to its limit, turning crimson, then purple, almost black, glistening from the internal pressure. The pain is as if a white-hot piece of iron is being slowly thrust into your body, twisting it again and again. This is a bubo, a sealed, pulsating sac of pus, clotted blood, and billions of bacteria swarming inside it like maggots in carrion. If it bursts outward, spewing its foul, thick, yellow-black contents, you have a ghost of a chance to survive. But more often, it explodes inward, releasing its deadly cargo directly into your bloodstream like a time bomb. And then begins the final, unbearable agony, the final act of this personal hell. This is not a disease from dusty history textbooks, not an abstract number in medieval chronicles. It is an eternal predator that has hunted humans for at least 5,000 years, perfecting its deadly art. Its genetic traces are found in the bones of Bronze Age people. They are older than the Egyptian pyramids and Stonehenge. It lurks in the wild, in the deep burrows of rodents in the steppes of Central Asia and the deserts of the American West, biding its time. And when it comes into the world of humans, it doesn't just kill, it changes everything. Autumn 1347. The Sicilian port of Messina, the sun-drenched gateway to Europe, bustling with noise and trade. 12 Genoese trading galleys, returning from a voyage on the Black Sea, slowly approach the pier. They move strangely, uncertainly, as if steered by ghosts. There are no signal flags on the masts. The usual noise and salty curses of sailors do not carry from the decks. An eerie, unnatural silence reigns, broken only by the creak of the rigging and the lapping of water against the hulls. The crowd, gathered on the shore, falls silent in bewilderment, feeling an inexplicable anxiety. When the pilots in their small boats draw closer to guide the ships into the harbor, they are seized with horror. The decks are strewn with the dead and dying, lying in their own filth amidst scattered bales of goods. The air around the ships is thick and sweetish with the smell of death, which assaults the nostrils, forcing one to recoil. Those few who could still stand were like living nightmares. Their faces were contorted by fever, their eyes burned with a mad fire, and their bodies were covered in black sores from which blood and pus oozed. They did not speak, only moaned, pointing with trembling hands to their swollen black buboes in their groins and armpits. They were the living dead, pleading not for help, but for a swift death. The port authorities, paralyzed by superstitious fear and unable to comprehend what they saw, gave the only possible order: to get back to sea immediately. The galleys were forbidden to dock. They were driven from the shore with arrows and threats. The cursed ships, having become floating coffins, slowly cast off and drifted along the coast, spreading the contagion to other ports. But it was already too late. The invisible passenger traveling aboard needed no permission to disembark. It had already come ashore, along with hundreds of black rats that had escaped down the mooring ropes in search of food, and thousands of fleas that had jumped onto the clothes of curious dock workers and onlookers who had come too close. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. The nightmare had begun, and it spread with the speed of a wildfire, following the trade routes as if along a fuse. From Messina, it leaped to Sardinia and Corsica, then struck mainland Italy, descending upon Pisa, Genoa, and most terribly Venice, the queen of the seas and the center of a world trade. No one understood what it was. God's punishment for the sins of mankind? Poisonous vapors? Miasmas that had risen from the depths of the earth after a recent earthquake? An unfavorable conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the constellation of Aquarius, heralding great calamities? The explanations were as numerous as they were useless, offering only false comfort in the face of the unthinkable. Doctors were completely powerless. Their knowledge, based on the works of Galen and Hippocrates, and the theory of the four bodily humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, proved useless in the face of this catastrophe. They believed the disease was caused by an imbalance of these humors and tried to treat the plague with bloodletting to draw out the bad blood, only weakening the already dying patients and hastening their end. They lanced the buboes with red-hot knives, releasing the contagion, and applied dried toads and spiders to them, which were supposed to absorb the poison. They prescribed drinking one's own urine or solutions made from crushed emeralds, accessible only to the very wealthy. But all of this was merely a ritual dance around death, powerless to stop it. Guided by the ancient theory of miasma, the belief that disease spread through bad air, poisonous vapors from rotting corpses, swamps, and other filth, people tried to combat the smell. The logic seemed flawless. If the disease was a bad smell, it needed to be overpowered by another, stronger and more pleasant one. Cities were drowned in the acrid smoke of juniper and pine bonfires burned on every street, and in the thick aroma of incense that filled churches and the homes of the wealthy. People carried pomanders with them, ornate balls of gold or silver filled with ambergris, musk, and expensive herbs. The poor simply held small bouquets of flowers, sponges soaked in vinegar, or simply scented rags to their noses as they walked through streets already piled with decomposing bodies. But death merely laughed at these pathetic attempts, for its carriers were not in the air, but on the fur of rats and in the blood of humans. The first plague doctors appeared, but not the ones whose sinister bird-masked image is popularized by mass culture, that would emerge only 300 years later during the 17th century epidemic. In the 14th century, they were simply officials hired by cities, often with no medical training at all, failed physicians, charlatans, or simply desperate daredevils willing to risk their lives for enormous sums of money and the promise of citizenship. Their job was not to heal, for there was nothing to heal with. Their job was to count the dead, to register them in the city ledgers so that the authorities would know the true scale of the catastrophe and could isolate the homes of the deceased. They were the accountants of death, walking among the dying and the doomed, their presence signifying not hope for salvation, but merely the official confirmation of a swift end. The very fabric of society began to disintegrate. Primal fear destroyed all human bonds, exposing the darkest side of human nature. Parents abandoned their sick children, locking them in rooms and fleeing their homes to save themselves. Children left their old, helpless parents to the mercy of fate. Husbands abandoned wives, wives their husbands. Neighbor avoided neighbor, friend avoided friend. This disaster struck such terror into the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and often wife her husband. And what is worse and almost incredible, fathers and mothers avoided visiting and looking after their children as if they were not their own, wrote Giovanni Boccaccio, an eyewitness to the plague in Florence, where more than half the population died. No one wept for the dead, because everyone expected their own death, echoed the chronicler from Siena, Agnolo di Tura, who buried 5 of his own children with his own hands. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that everyone believed it was the end of the world. The fields remained unharvested, livestock wandered unattended, and cities turned into giant abandoned cemeteries. In an atmosphere of total despair and the inevitability of the end, human nature revealed itself in all its extremity. Some plunged into extreme asceticism and religious fanaticism, trying to atone for the sins of the world. Ghastly processions of flagellants, self-flagellators, began to trail along the dusty roads of Europe. Their appearance in a town was a harbinger of even greater misfortunes. Hundreds, and sometimes thousands of men, stripped to the waist, their faces hidden under hoods, walked slowly from town to town, chanting penitential psalms. In their hands they held scourges with several leather towels, into which sharp metal spikes were woven. Rhythmically, to the beat of a drum and a mournful chant, they lashed their own backs, turning them into a bloody mess. They believed that by taking upon themselves the torments of Christ, they could appease an angered God. In reality, they only contributed to the spread of the contagion, gathering crowds of onlookers around them and carrying fleas from one infected city to another. Others, on the contrary, concluded that since tomorrow would not come, today must be lived to the fullest. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, became their motto. They feasted, drank to oblivion, and gave themselves over to the most savage debauchery, spending their last money on fleeting pleasures in taverns and brothels that operated around the clock. They would break into the deserted homes of the wealthy, where tables were still set, and hold frenzied orgies there until the plague claimed them too, often right in the midst of a feast. The streets, piled with corpses, became a stage for mad carnivals, where laughter mixed with death groans. But behind this desperate merriment lay only animalistic terror and the realization of complete hopelessness. The rule of law vanished, giving way to the right of the strong and the reckless. But humanity would not be humanity if, even in the face of apocalypse, it did not try to find a simple and convenient explanation, did not find a scapegoat on whom to vent its fear and hatred. and they, as was often the case in European history, became the Jews. Their separateness, different faith, and frequent engagement in usury made them an ideal target. A monstrous, absurd rumor, spread by fanatical preachers and a frenzied mob, crept through cities and villages from Spain to Poland. The Jews had poisoned the wells, springs, and rivers to wipe out the Christian world and seize power. It was an insane, irrational lie, devoid of all logic. The plague mowed down Jews in their isolated ghettos with the same, if not greater, mercilessness as it did Christians. But the mob, crazed with fear and grief, did not need proof. It needed a target. Pogroms began, unprecedented in their brutality since the time of the Crusades. In Toulon, France, 40 Jews were brutally murdered in their own quarter before the authorities could intervene. In Basel, Switzerland, several hundred Jews, including women and children, were herded into a specially built wooden shed on an island in the middle of the Rhine and burned alive. Their property was divided among the townspeople, and their debts were annulled. The most horrific massacre occurred in Strasbourg on St. Valentine's Day, February 14, 1349. 2,000 Jews were forcibly brought to the city cemetery. They were offered a monstrous choice: immediate baptism or death. Almost all chose death. They were bound and thrown onto a gigantic funeral pyre. The city chronicles dispassionately note that the massacre was carried out even before the plague reached Strasbourg. On the same day, the city council issued a decree forbidding Jews from settling in the city for 100 years and canceled all debts owed by Christians to Jewish moneylenders. The economic motive was obvious. Pope Clement VI, one of the few voices of reason in this hell, issued 2 bulls declaring the complete innocence of the Jews, pointing out that the plague was also raging in lands where there were no Jews. He threatened excommunication for all who participated in the pogroms and looting, but almost no one listened to him. Primal terror proved stronger than faith and papal authority. The wave of hatred was unstoppable. While Europe was going mad, burning the innocent, whipping itself with scourges, and praying to useless saints, no one asked the main question: where did this pestilence come from in the first place? How did it cross thousands of kilometers of land and sea, and end up on those 12 cursed galleys in the port of Messina? The answer lay not in the will of God or the movement of the planets, but in the cruelty and desperation of man. The answer lay far to the east, in Crimea, in the wealthy Genoese trading colony of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia. A year earlier, in 1346, the city was besieged by a huge army of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg. The Mongols were eager to capture this key point on the Great Silk Road, through which silk and spices flowed into Europe. The siege dragged on. The Genoese, sheltered behind powerful fortress walls, repelled all attacks, and then a sudden and terrible disease broke out in the Mongol camp. Soldiers died by the hundreds, then thousands. The army was melting away before their eyes. But Janibeg, facing imminent defeat, found a monstrous and ingenious use for his misfortune. He ordered the bloated, rotting corpses of his dead warriors to be loaded into giant catapults and trebuchets. Dozens of blackened bodies, spreading an unbearable stench, flew over the fortress walls, splatting onto the paved streets of Kaffa. This was the first documented and large-scale biological attack in human history. Mountains of the dead were thrown into the city, wrote the Italian notary Gabriele de Musi, possibly an eyewitness to the events, and the Christians could neither hide nor flee nor escape this plague. They cast the bodies into the sea as much as they could, but soon the air was poisoned and the water was contaminated. The fortress defenders, in horror, threw the gruesome projectiles into the sea, but it was too late. The contagion had already penetrated the city. Kaffa fell not to swords and arrows, but to microscopic bacteria. The Genoese merchants and all who could, in a panic, rushed to their ships, seeking to flee the doomed city. They fled home, to Genoa, to Venice, to Italy, and they carried with them an invisible and most terrible passenger. Thus began the first act of the greatest tragedy in European history. Over the next 5 years, from 1347 to 1352, the Black Death would wipe out, according to various estimates, from 1/3 to half of the continent's entire population. About 50 million people. It would devastate thousands of cities and villages, change the economy, politics, and religion, and undermine the power of the church and feudal lords. The world would never be the same again. But the plague did not disappear forever. It merely lay dormant, retreating to its natural reservoirs, only to return again and again, in deadly wave after deadly wave, over the subsequent centuries. London, 1665, Vienna, 1679, Marseille, 1720, Moscow, 1771. Each new outbreak was a new chapter in an endless book of horror, a new reminder of the fragility of human civilization and that the enemy had not gone anywhere. People gradually grew accustomed to it, as one grows accustomed to war, famine, or a harsh winter. They learned to survive, developing cruel but effective methods. Quarantines were invented. The word itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, 40 days, the period that arriving ships had to wait in port before the crew and passengers were allowed to disembark. Any violation was punishable by death. Plague houses, or lazarettos, were established, where not only the sick, but also all members of their families were forcibly taken. The doors and windows of these buildings were often boarded up, condemning the people inside to certain death from starvation and disease. Sometimes, in a fit of desperation, the authorities would simply burn these houses down with everyone inside. It was appalling cruelty, but, as it seemed then, the only effective measure capable of stopping the spread of the contagion. It was in the 17th century, during the era of these recurring epidemics, that the famous and frightening figure of the plague doctor appeared. A long, waxed cloak of leather or oiled fabric, tall boots, thick gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and, of course, a mask with a long, bird-alike beak and glass eyepieces. This mask was not an element of intimidation, as it might seem. It was a primitive but conceptually brilliant respirator. The long beak was filled with strong-smelling medicinal herbs, spices, frankincense, and camphor. Doctors still believed they were protecting themselves from miasmas, from bad air. They did not know that the real enemy was microscopic, that it traveled on fleas, not in smells. But their costume, by creating a barrier between them and their patients, did indeed offer some protection, saving the lives of the few brave souls. The enemy was biding its time to strike again, but this time in a completely different, changed world. The age of steam and electricity was dawning, the age of great empires and global trade, an age when the world became tighter and smaller. And the third great plague pandemic, which began in the remote Chinese province of Yunnan in 1855, no longer spread at the speed of a sailing galley, but at the speed of a steamship. This was the plague of the modern era, and its consequences were global. For decades, it smoldered quietly in the depths of China, claiming thousands of lives but remaining unnoticed by the rest of the world. Local officials, fearing the emperor's wrath, systematically concealed the truth. Tens of thousands of my people were dying from the plague, but I always wrote in my reports that all was well with us, one of the mandarins would later cynically admit. But you cannot hide a fire forever, especially when it is burning on a powder keg. In 1894, the fire broke out. The plague reached the major port city of Canton, and from there, with the flow of goods and people, it reached Hong Kong. British Hong Kong, the jewel of the crown, a crucial trade hub connecting east and west. Every day, dozens of steamships departed from its harbor, carrying silk, tea, porcelain, and death across the world. Soon, cases of the plague were reported in India, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, South Africa, and even San Francisco. Panic gripped the colony. The British authorities were in complete despair. They understood nothing about this disease. The local Chinese residents, distrusting European medicine, hid the sick, turned to traditional healers, and secretly buried the dead at night, which made any kind of control impossible. The epidemic spread like a wildfire in dry weather. The streets were full of the dying, and the hospitals were overflowing. The world needed its best minds. Two of the most famous microbe hunters of that era were urgently summoned to Hong Kong. One of them was the celebrated Japanese bacteriologist Shibesaburo Kitasato. A brilliant student of the great Robert Koch, he had already discovered the tetanus bacillus and enjoyed an unassailable reputation. He arrived with a large team of assistants and the most modern German equipment. He was welcomed as a savior, provided with every facility for his work. The second was the Swiss-French physician Alexandre Yersin. He was the complete opposite of Kitasato. Yersin, a student of the legendary Louis Pasteur, was a genius, but also an introvert and a rebel. He hated academic routine and high society. He had preferred the life of a ship's doctor and adventurous journeys through the unexplored jungles of Vietnam to a brilliant career in Paris. He was a loner, accustomed to relying only on himself. When Yersin, having interrupted his expedition, arrived in Hong Kong, no one was waiting for him and no one met him. Tired, in a crumpled travel suit, he made no impression on the prim British authorities, who had already placed their bet on the brilliant Japanese team. Kitasato, jealously guarding his fame and intolerant of competition, saw in the modest Yersin only an annoying hindrance and did everything to get rid of him. The Japanese were allocated a spacious, well-equipped laboratory in the main Kennedytown Hospital. Yersin, however, after his persistent requests, was given only a tiny bamboo hut on the hospital grounds, without windows, water, or any equipment. He was strictly forbidden from approaching the hospital morgues. Kitasato was already working with corpses, and the British did not want to offend their eminent guest. Yersin found himself in complete isolation. It seemed he was doomed to a humiliating failure. But Yersin would not have been Yersin if he had given up. He did not get into arguments with the authorities or scheme against his competitor. He went another way, his own way. At night, in secret, he snuck into the cemetery where the Chinese who had died of the plague were buried. For a few silver coins and a bottle of whiskey, he bribed the British soldiers from the burial detail. He got what he needed: access to a fresh, not yet buried corpse. Under the cover of night, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp in his wretched bamboo hut, Yersin single-handedly performed an autopsy. He was not a pathologist, but a bacteriologist, and only one organ interested him: the black, swollen bubo. At the risk of his life, he made an incision and extracted a sample of purulent, bloody tissue. He placed a tiny slice under the lens of his old microscope. and he saw them. Myriads of tiny, short rods. They were everywhere. There were billions of them. Yersin tried to stain them with standard dyes to see them better, but they hardly took the stain. Only methylene blue lightly stained their ends, leaving the middle clear. This gave them a strange, characteristic shape, similar to a safety pin. Yersin realized that he was seeing something completely new. Meanwhile, in his sparkling laboratory, Kitasato also announced his success. He pompously declared to the press that he had found the plague bacillus in the blood of patients. He described it as a gram-positive rod, and even took micrographs. The scientific world applauded. But Yersin, after reading the report, was doubtful. He had also examined patients' blood, but had found only isolated bacteria there, whereas the buboes were literally teeming with them. Something was wrong with the discovery of his famous rival. Yersin decided to conduct a decisive experiment that would put everything in its place. He prepared a pure culture of his bacteria, taken from a bubo, and injected it into a laboratory mouse. The next morning, the mouse was dead. Its blood, liver, and spleen were teeming with those same safety pin-shaped rods. There were no doubts left. This was the killer. He had found it. So, why did the celebrated Kitasato, who had all possible resources, make a mistake? The answer was simple and ridiculously ironic. Kitasato, having the best equipment, placed his samples in an incubator heated to 37 degrees Celsius, the ideal temperature for the growth of most human pathogens. Poor Yersin had no incubator. His cultures grew at the room temperature of the Hong Kong heat, around 28-30 degrees. It was later discovered that the plague bacillus, which would be named Yersinia pestis in honor of Yersin, competes poorly with other microbes at high temperatures. In Kitasato's incubator, a common pneumococcus had grown, which is often present in the body and causes secondary infections in weakened patients. But at the lower temperature in Yersin's hut, it was the slow-growing plague bacillus that gained the advantage and grew into a pure culture. Poverty and a lack of equipment helped the lone rebel make the greatest discovery, outpacing the scientific establishment. He did not trumpet his victory in the newspapers. He silently sent his results, samples, and a detailed description to the Pasteur Institute in Paris. The scientific world was in turmoil. Two different discoveries from two famous scientists. But when other laboratories around the world tried to reproduce their results, Yersin's irrefutable correctness became obvious. The microbe described by Kitasato did not cause plague in test animals. Yersin's microbe killed with 100% accuracy. The enemy that had terrorized humanity for millennia was finally found, identified, and named. Soon, Yersin himself developed the first anti-plague serum based on horseblood, and his colleague at the Pasteur Institute, Vladimir Hafkin, an émigré from the Russian Empire, created the first effective vaccine. It seemed that humanity had finally gotten its hands on a powerful weapon against its most ancient and merciless enemy. But the plague had prepared another, most terrible and unexpected surprise. It was waiting for its moment not in the hot ports, but in the icy north of China, in Manchuria. There, the enemy showed its most terrible face, threatening the entire world with a new, even more terrifying pandemic. Winter, 1910, Manchuria. In the early 20th century, this cold, sparsely populated region at the junction of China, Russia, and Mongolia was the world's main supplier of valuable Tarbagan marmot fur. Thousands of poor Chinese hunters and seasonal workers flocked here every winter for the trade. They lived in appalling overcrowding and unsanitary conditions in damp, cold dugouts. And the Tarbagan marmot, as we now know, is one of the main natural reservoirs of the plague. That year, a terrible epizootic broke out among the marmots. They died by the thousands, crawling out of their burrows and behaving strangely, losing all fear of humans. But for the poor hunters, a sick, lethargic animal that didn't run away was not a danger, but easy prey. They trapped the sick marmots en masse, skinned them right in their overcrowded dugouts, and ate the meat. And they became infected. But this was not the plague the world knew. It was not the classic bubonic form, transmitted by flea bites. The harsh Manchurian winter with its 40-degree frosts killed the fleas and limited their activity. The bacterium, faced with unfavorable conditions, mutated and adapted. It found a new, much more effective and terrifying path: through the air. This was primary pneumonic plague, the most contagious and deadliest form of the disease. It directly attacked the lungs and was transmitted from person to person through coughing, breathing, and talking. The incubation period was only 24 to 48 hours. Symptoms were fever, a cough with bloody sputum, and a swift death from asphyxiation. The mortality rate was 100%. There were no survivors. The epidemic exploded in the city of Harbin, a major railway hub on the Chinese Eastern Railway, built by Russians and inhabited by people from all over the world. The city was instantly plunged into hell. People coughed up blood and dropped dead right on the streets, in shops, in train cars. The corpses froze in grotesque poses, covered in frost. There were so many that they couldn't be buried in time. They were simply stacked like firewood along the roads. The panic was indescribable. It was stronger than the fear of death. A mass exodus from Harbin and other cities began. Tens of thousands of people stormed the trains, trying to flee anywhere, to Beijing, deeper into China, to Siberia. They did not know they were already carrying death in their lungs, that their every breath was infecting the air in the overcrowded cars. This was not just a local epidemic. It was a threat on a planetary scale. The pneumonic plague, upon reaching the densely populated cities of China, India, and then Europe, could have caused a pandemic compared to which the Black Death would have seemed a minor incident. The Chinese government of the Qing dynasty, on the verge of collapse, desperately turned for help to a young but already world-renowned doctor. His name was Wu Liante. Of Chinese descent, born in Malaysia, he had received a brilliant medical education at Cambridge University. He was one of the best epidemiologists of his time, a man who combined Western scientific methodology with a deep understanding of Chinese culture. Arriving in Harbin at the height of the epidemic, Wu Liantao saw a scene of true apocalypse. He immediately understood that he was not dealing with the classic bubonic plague described in textbooks. He insisted on performing an autopsy, which was a strict taboo in Chinese culture, where the body of the deceased was considered inviolable. In a frozen barracks, risking his own life, he dissected the body of one of the Japanese victims. His worst suspicions were confirmed. There were no buboes. The lungs were black with blood and necrosis. It was primary pneumonic plague.